happening now all over the world. Now you can hold girls back. You can have a sexist society where girls don't have access to education, or you close off the professions, and so young women won't show up. But what happens when you open the doors, you encourage everyone, you have a meritocracy, and everyone can compete? Well, the girls are winning the prizes. The girls are, if you go and see an honor roll at a typical high school, who's getting the A's, who is the valedictorian, and it's not anecdotal. The Department of Education keeps meticulous records. We can look at graphs of grade point averages, who take AP courses, who goes to college. The college gap is becoming a chasm, with young women now approaching 57% of college enrollments. There's a test called the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP. I think it's probably one of the best measures of how children are doing. And they look at writing skills, reading skills, math, and science. And in recent years, there used to be never a big gap, but a fairly large gap favoring boys in math and science, and that has closed. No, it hasn't closed. It's become smaller. Boys are now about 3 points ahead of girls in math and 4 points in science. Girls, on the other hand, score about 13 points ahead of boys in reading and 18 points in writing. And that has not changed. In fact, it appears to be getting worse. What this means is that the average 17-year-old boy has the writing skills of a 15-year-old girl. And that's probably the best data we have from the National Center for Education Statistics. And also, I mentioned this before, but according to the College Board, if you look at honors, math, and science programs, even those have more girls now, 54%, 46% boys. And then if you go outside math and science to AP, then just say goodbye to the boys. I mean, they're just, if you go to an advanced placement foreign language course or art and music course, well, there are some boys, but I think the last figure I saw was 62% girls for art and music and foreign languages and 61% for English. One other interesting difference between men and women is if you give, again, if you have a good sample, you give them an intelligence test. Men tend to show up at the extremes. I mean, not most men, but let's just say that across the ability distribution, you have more men at the extremes of success and failure. Didn't mean to say men show up at the extremes, but to the extent that anybody's at the extreme, it tends to be guys. In other words, if you took people with freakishly high IQs, I haven't seen the latest comparison, but far more men than women, something like 4 to 1. If you go, the higher you go, the more men. It's tilted in favor of men. However, Mother Nature is fair. At the other extreme of anti-genius, if you will, you find more men. You find more, well, all the way, you find more males who are borderline retarded, who have all sorts of learning disabilities, but then at the extremes, the low extreme of ability, you find more males. If someone were to take the SAT and got a perfect score in 8th grade, it's probably a boy. If someone took it in 12th grade and got them all wrong, probably it was a guy. So it's just another difference. So we've got, and now most of us are in the middle. Most people are somewhere, near the mean, obviously, and they're not differences in intelligence. The average man should not feel superior to a woman because of what's happening out on the extreme, because individuals, on average, there's not a difference in male and female IQs. You can't predict who's smarter just knowing someone's a man and a woman. These are exceptional cases. Now, girls were behind in math and science, and still haven't caught up entirely, but we had a massive effort to strengthen them at every level, every federal and state and the women's lobbying groups. The math gap was treated as a kind of crisis. and addressed, and a lot of the things that were done were good and did strengthen girls, and I admire them. However, why didn't we do the same thing for boys? When already, at the same time that we saw the math and science gap that favored boys, there was a much larger, I would say it was a chasm, favoring girls in reading and writing. Not just reading and writing, in college matriculation, in school engagement. It's another area that the Department of Education studies quite carefully. Like, how much does a child care about school? Girls care a lot more. Girls care, a lot of girls, they want the teacher to like them. It's very important. I remember being shocked that it wasn't that important to my sons that their teacher liked them. I always wanted my teachers to like them. I couldn't believe it. But the Department of Education has very good data, just ready to learn. You know, girls are much more likely to come with their pencils and their paper and their homework and their, you know, and boys, if you have a son or a little brother, or you yourself may have been like that, although if you're at this law school, you were the exception. But the boys, the disorganization to a point which is almost inconceivable, terrible organizational skills, and less engagement. Now, these are all problems. Now, some of the women's groups say, well, boys catch up eventually. That used to be true, and it used to be true that you could go through school, get a high school diploma, and make it into the middle class. And I'll give you some data in a moment where this is just increasingly impossible. I mean, you go back to 90s, recent, not that recent, but in the 70s, it was still the case that most people didn't have more than a high school diploma, and you worked hard and you found your niche, and you could make a good living. It's almost impossible now if you don't have some education, specialized education, after high school. So we have more boys dropping out of high school. What's going to happen to them? It's appalling if you look at the predictions on their life earnings, their prospects. Now, with the girls, we passed something called the Gender Equity and Education Act. We took our daughters to work. We had girl power movement. It was a massive, overwhelming effort, and I think it worked up to a point. There's still young women in trouble as well. But overall, if you look at the trajectory, what you see is, and I saw it in my classes. I was teaching philosophy in the 80s and 90s, and more. Clark University was one of these schools which was getting more and more girls, and reaching a point that the college admissions officers among themselves, they call it the tipping point. And it's a dangerous point because if you have too many girls in your school, apparently 60% is the limit. You go over that, and the girls don't want to go there. I think they want to have at least one date in college. So if it's all girls. The boys, by the way, don't seem to mind it. If they're in the minority, and they don't mind it. So a lot of the problems I'm describing, the guys are not going to organize and protest, because the ones who are in these colleges, they're not unhappy about it, and the other guys are not. They're not organized. Here's the problem in a nutshell: is in the 1950s and 60s, there was a tremendous amount of what Gloria Allred would call gender apartheid. That's too extreme, but women were held back. We needed reforms, and we needed the women's movement. And we had this dynamic, electric movement that changed the world and opened up all these doors to women. And we built up at the same time. It didn't happen for no reason. There were organizations. There was the National Organization for Women, there was the American Association of University Women, there was the National Women's Law Center, and then smaller and smaller state organizations and women's agencies, and on every campus you had women's studies. You had a vast network of women's groups pushing for women's rights. What happens when women get their rights? What happens when you're the American Association of University Women, and you came into existence because women, in the 19th century, I think, when the AAUW began, when women were really struggling and didn't have many opportunities, and your goal is to support women's education. What happens when women are 50% college students, 60%? Do you just close up shop and go home? Well, they don't do that. It just turns out that they don't declare victory and go home. So we have today a network of engaged women's organizations full of feminist litigators from law schools like this. Well, maybe not this one, but I don't know where they all come from. The National Women's Law Center, you have these litigious feminists who will not accept yes for an answer. They're knocking down doors that are already open. And if you dare to suggest that there's a problem with boys, they call it backlash. They say you're a traitor to your gender, and it's... I have it in here somewhere. I want to quote it exactly. It's a quote from the American Association of University Women. Well, I'll just quote it from memory. They say, this is on their website, about anybody that challenges their equity agenda. They say, we're breaking down barriers. We've done it before. We're going to do it again and again. And anybody that gets in our way, we're going to come after you. And it's so ridiculous what you face if you challenge this juggernaut of organizations for boys called a backlasher. I'll just give you an example of how it works. A few years ago, the New York Times ran a front-page story about the academic deficits of Hispanic girls. And the headline said, well, troubling label for Hispanics, girls most likely to drop out. And there were charts and graphs and photos, and it was worrisome what was happening with these girls. And the article was quite informative. Buried in paragraph 6 was a little throwaway sentence. It said, the only group that has a higher dropout rate among all students is Hispanic boys. 31% of Hispanic boys drop out. I think it was 25% of the girls. But it was 31% of the boys. That was the last we heard about them. And after reading that story, I called up the reporter.